I've been thinking about this idea of tough love because it's probably one of the most common pieces of advice families get and give. And the more I've thought about it, the more I wonder if we're even talking about the same thing when we use that phrase. So early in my career, I worked in both residential treatment and intensive outpatient treatment. Many of my clients were desperate for family therapy, but it wasn't offered or encouraged where I was. When I approached admin about it, I was told that these people had burned their bridges and their families weren't interested in repairing the ruptures caused by addiction, so my requests to offer vital interventions were ignored, telling the families their loved ones needed tough love to get sober, and didn't bother telling the families what tough love actually looked like. It also wasn't my experience, though. I actually saw the opposite. Before we get started, if you're enjoying my content and want to learn more about navigating addiction in your family, coercive control, trauma, or dysfunctional relationship patterns, like and subscribe for more evidence-based conversations about addiction, family systems, recovery, and relational healing. Now, when somebody tells a loved one, you need to practice tough love, what are they actually telling that person to do? Because sometimes they're meaning for you to stop giving your addicted loved one money. Stop calling their employer when they don't show up for work. Stop lying for them. Stop cleaning up every mess that their substance use creates. And then sometimes tough love means something very different. It means cutting them off completely, kicking them out, giving them an ultimatum, making them suffer enough that they'll finally decide they have a problem and get help. These are very different approaches, but we tend to put them under this umbrella of tough love, and that can be a problem. So I looked at the research, and the research shows we've studied these approaches pretty extensively. Now again, and as always, I want to be very clear here. When the addiction creates an unsafe environment or there is abuse present, this conversation changes. What I'm about to go over may not even apply to you if you're in an environment where your safety is threatened. I'll link some resources for you to reach out if you are in need of immediate help. There was a really interesting randomized clinical trial published in the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology in 1999 that compared 3 different approaches families could use when someone with an alcohol problem wasn't interested in treatment. One was an Al-Anon-based approach, one was the Johnson Institute intervention, and the third was CRAFT, Community Reinforcement and Family Training. The Al-Anon approach was focused primarily on the member. It was about helping the concerned person cope, detach from the chaos, and become involved in a mutual help program. It wasn't really designed to persuade the drinker to enter treatment. Now, the Johnson approach was different. That's the intervention most people probably picture when they hear the word intervention. The family prepares, usually with a professional, and then confronts the person with the substance problem about the consequences of their drinking or drug use. The family explains what has happened, what they've experienced, and what they're going to do if the person refuses treatment. And then there was CRAFT. CRAFT took a completely different approach. Instead of asking, how do we confront this person? It asked, what can we teach the family to do differently that might make treatment more appealing and make the family less likely to reinforce the substance use? And they put these approaches head to head. 130 concerned significant others participated in that study. The people whose family members received CRAFT got their loved ones into treatment at a rate of 64%. The Johnson group was 30%. The Al-Anon facilitation group was 13%. That's a pretty substantial difference, and this is one of those studies where I think the details are way more interesting than the headline, because the Johnson intervention wasn't completely ineffective. Among the people who actually went through with the confrontation, about 75% got their addicted loved one into treatment. The problem was that most of the families assigned to the Johnson approach never actually got to that confrontation. About 70% actually decided not to go through with it. So when you look at the whole sample, CRAFT got significantly more people into treatment. That finding wasn't just from one study either. A later randomized trial looked at 90 concerned significant others of people who were refusing treatment for illicit drug use. They compared CRAFT with Al-Anon and Nar-Anon facilitation approach. CRAFT alone got 58.6% of the drug users into treatment. CRAFT plus additional group aftercare got 76.7% into treatment. The Al-Anon and Nar-Anon condition was 29%. And then in 2010, researchers did a systematic review of 4 randomized controlled trials comparing CRAFT with Al-Anon, Nar-Anon, and the Johnson intervention. They found that Kraft produced about 3 times the treatment engagement of Al-Anon and Nar-Anon and about twice the treatment engagement of the Johnson intervention. Not only that, but this study found that the families who used the Kraft method actually improved psychosocially and physically no matter what types of support they sought when their loved one entered treatment. That's pretty incredible to me, so naturally I want to know why. What is Kraft actually doing that seems to make this work better? Well, because Kraft isn't telling the family to be permissive, and it's not telling their family to completely cut their loved one off either. The family's actually taught to stop reinforcing the substance use. They're taught to reinforce sober or healthy behavior instead. They're taught communication skills. They're taught how to make treatment easier to access when the person becomes willing. They're also taught to take care of themselves. So when people hear me say that I'm skeptical of tough love, I don't want them to hear keep rescuing the person. That's not even close to what the evidence is saying. In fact, Kraft takes the consequences of substance use very seriously. It just doesn't make suffering the mechanism of change like tough love does. There's a difference between allowing a consequence to happen and creating a consequence because you believe the pain will force someone to change. That last part is manipulation, and it's never going to stick. If your adult son gets drunk and misses work and you stop calling his boss to explain why he isn't there, you're no longer protecting him from a consequence that belongs to him. That's different from saying, I'm going to take your car away because I need you to understand that I'm serious. And look, I get it. People are desperate. When someone you love is in active addiction and you are in fear for their lives, you will try quite literally anything. But instead of driving yourself crazy trying to change their behavior, change your participation. Sometimes those two things look exactly the same from the outside, but psychologically they're very different. This is also where I think Al-Anon gets misunderstood. I've heard people say, well, Al-Anon teaches you to detach, so isn't that basically tough love? Not really. Al-Anon wasn't developed as a way to get somebody into treatment. It's a mutual help program for people affected by someone else's drinking. The research comparing Al-Anon facilitation with Kraft is a little tricky if you don't understand what each intervention was designed to accomplish. In that 1999 study, Al-Anon facilitation was specifically being used as an intervention through the family member with the goal of getting the drinker into treatment. And it didn't perform as well as Kraft for that particular outcome. That doesn't mean Al-Anon doesn't help families. In fact, research on family-involved treatment has found benefits for family functioning and coping, and Al-Anon can give people a place to talk about something that is incredibly isolating. And then there's the Johnson intervention. This one is especially interesting because it has been around for decades, and we've become so familiar with it that we almost assume it must be evidence-based. But when you actually look at the research, the picture isn't super impressive. There was an older study that found the Johnson approach could get people into treatment, particularly when the family actually followed through with the confrontation, but there were problems with treatment retention afterward. And when the evidence was reviewed more broadly, the picture became less favorable. In fact, those in the Johnson intervention relapsed at rates between 38 and 79% and were less likely to complete treatment. The U.S. Surgeon General's report on addiction specifically noted that planned surprise confrontations modeled on the Johnson intervention had not been demonstrated to be effective for engaging people in treatment. It also noted concerns about confrontational approaches actually increasing resistance. SAMHSA's 2020 treatment guidance went even further. The Johnson intervention was completely removed from its family counseling recommendations because the evidence base was old and limited, and because researchers had raised concerns about the approach being overly confrontational, judgmental, or blaming. That's pretty significant because we're not talking about whether confrontation feels good or bad. We're talking about what the evidence tells us. And the evidence doesn't give us much reason to believe that humiliating someone, cornering them, or increasing the emotional pressure around their addiction is some particularly effective pathway into recovery. But here's where I think the tough love conversation gets a little more complicated. Because there are families listening to this thinking, okay, but what am I supposed to do? I'm not going to keep giving my son money. I'm not going to let him use drugs in my house. I'm not going to let my daughter drive my grandchildren around while she's high. And I agree with you. That's not what this is about, and it's not what Kraft asks you to do. In fact, one of the things I appreciate about Kraft is that it gives families something much more concrete than just love them or cut them off. It gives them skills. It asks them to pay attention to what happens before and after the substance use. It asks them to notice where they're accidentally reinforcing the behavior. It teaches them how to communicate in ways that are more likely to be heard, and it teaches them how to respond differently when the person is sober or engaging in healthy behavior. That's a very different philosophy from waiting for somebody to hit bottom. And honestly, I wish we would just scrub the whole hit bottom idea because it is so harmful. There isn't one universal bottom. One person loses their job and gets sober. Another person loses their job and uses more. One person gets arrested and decides they want treatment. Another person gets arrested and comes out of jail with a more severe substance use problem and better connections to get their drugs. So when we say they just need to hit bottom, what we're really saying is that, well, we don't know what will motivate this particular person to get sober. And that's honest. But I think we should be honest about that rather than turning it into a treatment philosophy. Because suffering is not a treatment. Consequences are not a treatment. And a family member's ability to create consequences is not the same thing as their ability to create motivation. That's probably the biggest thing that I would change about the way we talk about tough love. I don't think families need to become softer. I think they need to become more precise. If you're paying someone's rent while they're spending their money on drugs, that's something you can change. If you're lying to their employer, that's something you can stop doing. If someone is using in your house, you can decide what you're willing to allow in your home. If they're driving intoxicated with your children, you can take steps to protect your children. Those are decisions that you can make. But if you're doing those things because you believe the right combination of consequences will finally make somebody recover, I think you're setting yourself up for a tremendous amount of frustration because you can make a reasonable decision for yourself and they can still continue using. That's the part that families don't always get warned about because there's not a focus on treating families, and there needs to be. You can do everything right and they may not change. And that doesn't mean that your boundary failed. It means the boundary was never a treatment for their addiction in the first place. I think that's where the research on craft is actually really useful. It gives families something between rescuing and abandoning. And I think that's what people are really looking for when they ask about tough love. They're trying to figure out how to love someone without participating in the addiction. They're trying to figure out how to stop rescuing without feeling like they're abandoning their child, their spouse, or their sibling. They're trying to figure out how to set a boundary without turning that boundary into a threat. So does tough love work? Well, it depends what you mean by tough love. If you mean allowing natural consequences, stopping behaviors that reinforce the addiction, and setting boundaries that protect you and your family, those are compatible with evidence-based family approaches. If you mean confronting someone in a highly pressurized meeting and making the treatment the condition for continued contact, the evidence for the Johnson model is considerably weaker, and major federal guidance has moved away from it. If you mean a family support approach like Al-Anon, that's a different thing entirely. It can provide support and coping for the family, but it isn't the same intervention as craft and shouldn't be judged by the same outcome. And if you mean I'm going to make their life painful enough that they'll finally recover, I don't think we have evidence for that at all. You don't have to make somebody suffer in order to stop participating in the consequences of their addiction. You can change what you do. You can stop rescuing. You can set boundaries. You can protect your kids. You can encourage treatment. You can stay connected when connection is safe and healthy, and you can accept something that is incredibly difficult for families to accept. You cannot make another person recover. I know that isn't a very satisfying answer when you're desperate for your loved one to change, but I think it's a more honest one, and honestly, I would rather give a family an honest answer than give them one more strategy that promises to finally make the addiction stop. Look, I know that pain all too well. And there are no one-size-fits-all answers for any of this. There's a ton of books and research. But in the end, when you love someone in active addiction, you are terribly isolated and terrified of doing the wrong thing. So what I will say here is, do what you can live with. If cutting someone off until they get sober is that thing, I won't tell you it's the wrong thing, because it may be the right thing for you. What I will caution is, don't paint yourself into a corner with your boundaries. Be honest with yourself. If you can live with it and it feels like the best thing for your situation, then go with that. Well, that's all for this time. I appreciate you being here. I've included links to the research I mentioned in case you want to look things up yourself. You may find something I missed. If so, drop a comment. And if this episode resonated with you, share it with someone you think might need to hear it too. Until next time.